I'm John Batts from Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations, and we're very pleased to welcome Michael Rubin, a former Pentagon official who's writing now in the Daily News. I recommend you all can go to your Daily News now. There's a piece up within these last hours about Syria and the remarks by the President of the United States, eerily, spookily, a year to the day since the newest report of a chemical weapons attack in the eastern outskirts of Damascus, to the east of the city, towards the interior of the city. The president said, a year to the day of the report of this attack, quote, "A red line for us is when we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus." Michael, a very good evening to you. Thank you for this. Any evidence that the president's calculus has changed? Have you seen evidence of the White House coming forward and explaining its policy to the American people? Good evening.
There has not been any evidence of a real substantive change. Certainly, the administration and administration officials have been good at tweeting outrage at Bashar al-Assad for the alleged use of chemical weapons, but that's not going to impact Bashar al-Assad's decision-making. The fact of the matter is a red line that is not abided by, in effect, becomes a green light for any rogue in the Middle East.
Do you think that the rebels have gotten hold of the chemical weapons? According to some of the reports in the last 24, 36 hours, their raids on some of the Air Force bases and military depots have yielded not only advanced rocketry and anti-tank rockets, but also chemical weapons.
Well, according to the United Nations, in an earlier report before this latest incident, both the rebels and Bashar al-Assad's regime have used chemical weapons against each other. But rather than get into a he said, she said about who was responsible for this latest outrage, what I think the United States needs to do is sit back and worry less about who actually used the chemical weapons here and consider whether the red line for us should be the use of the chemical weapons or any of these regimes getting weapons of mass destruction. Because if Syria teaches us one thing, they've had chemical capabilities for over 2 decades. It is eventually, when regimes acquire this capability, it is foreseeable that they would use it. And it's not just about the chemicals in Syria anymore. It could just as well be about potential nuclear weapons in Iran.
And the lesson we learned from Libya is chemical and other weapons.
Indeed.
So I think it's a very important point, and it's one that's generally lost in the assessments here. Can I switch a little bit to Turkey,
We move from
John?
eastern Damascus to the northern border of Syria. Go ahead, Malcolm.
How do you interpret the statement? I mean, it's not out of character anymore, but Erdogan now saying that he had evidence they're blaming Israel, and it turns out it was some television report of a panel in which somebody speculated about some of the problems in Egypt. Why all of this provocation? Is it for domestic purposes or positioning himself in the region?
Well, initially I would have theorized that Recep Tayyip Erdogan was doing this to position himself in the region, but increasingly he seems like a combination of Russian ultranationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky combined with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad with just a sprinkling of Muammar Gaddafi craziness on top. And the fact of the matter is, here's a man who feels himself so secure in power and has been so isolated in a bubble with sycophants that he feels that he can get away with speaking his mind. And that should be what is really scaring us, that this NATO ally, a leader who President Obama has identified as one of his closest foreign friends, is blaming the Jews for the coup in Egypt, as if Jews control the Egyptian army. And the latest speculation in the Turkish press has been Erdogan's obsession with Israelis using telekinesis in order to kill prominent Turks. I mean, it just gets weirder and wackier.
Oh, didn't everybody know that? But, John, what about the sense that you hear from all the experts you talk to about how this plays at home? What is the domestic impact?
I recall a moment more than any other, the President of the United States and Mr. Erdogan in the Rose Garden, when it started to rain gently and the media was not given cover, but 2 very good-looking Marines approached with umbrellas and stood there holding their arms straight out for the President of the United States and the Prime Prime Minister of Erdogan. It was a moment that freezes for me that relationship. We're told for years, there have been anecdotes for years that the president spends more time on the phone with Mr. Erdogan than any other leader, perhaps in the world, but certainly in the Middle East. And to hear these odd reports about Mr. Erdogan, and to know that the president of the United States as recently as May, you could say, embraced Mr. Erdogan's kind of government, his sense of proportion, is a disconnect for me, Malcolm. That's what I hear, that the American people aren't going to put domestic policy behind foreign policy. They're just not going to do it, right? We have an economy, it drives itself. But that's an odd moment, Malcolm, and there's no explanation for it. Michael, I'll ask you the question. Do the American people put that strange moment in the Rose Garden together with these statements by Mr. Erdogan?
I think increasingly they are, but I'm still disappointed with just how many American congressmen are members of the Congressional Turkey Caucus. They may believe that Turkey is a model, and they may talk about Turkey's role in NATO, but what they don't see is that the Turkish government uses their membership as an endorsement of its policies. Ultimately, I think we need to have some soul-searching at home, but when we look at that moment on May 16th in the Rose Garden, there were a couple other things which didn't come to the notice of Americans. While that meeting was going on, Turkish police were raiding one of the largest independent media companies in order to shut it down. And in order to welcome Prime Minister Erdogan to Washington, President Obama placed an op-ed in a once vibrant newspaper called Sabah, which is Turkish for morning. That was a newspaper which was a leading opposition newspaper, which Erdogan confiscated and gave to his son-in-law. And so many Turks looked at that with exasperation, saying, we're suffering from a crackdown on the press, and President Obama seems to be endorsing that crackdown.
But if any Arab leader, certainly ones I've talked to, this is one of the key things that makes them most angry, yelling, is this the model you want? Is this who you want to see? Islamists in, democracy out. And it's really a source of consternation throughout the region. But Michael, do you have any sense what's the play inside Turkey today? What is Erdogan standing? We see more support for Gulen's movement emerging.
We have less than a minute, Michael. Go ahead.
Well, indeed, the way to look at Turkey is as a three-part domination of factions. You have Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the prime minister. You have Abdullah Gül, the president, who's an Islamist but a little bit more moderate. And then you have the shadowy cult leader, Fethullah Gülen, who controls the security forces. They're all maneuvering for power, but all of them in one way or another are bad news.
Michael Rubin, former Pentagon official, is at the American Enterprise Institute. His forthcoming book, due within the year. We're counting on it, Michael. Dancing with the Devil, A History of U.S. Diplomacy with Rogue Regimes and Terrorist Groups. Chapters being added momentarily. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations. And right now, Turkey is an ally of the United States, and it's part of the conversation of order in the region. But look underneath the covers. I'm John Batchelor.